This submitted analysis explores the cascading global economic and geopolitical impacts of the 2026 U.S.-Israel-Iran war, with a specific focus on the complex diplomatic architecture between the United States and China during the crisis. Looking at the material, it demonstrates a really sophisticated grasp of some very complex data. But our goal today is to critically evaluate the main claims and geopolitical arguments to make the core thesis much more robust and original. So let's jump right into the first major area for improvement.
The draft portrays China's exposure to the Strait of Hormuz closure primarily as an economic vulnerability that the United States can leverage. But it misses the opportunity to fully explore how Beijing's relative insulation allows it to use the crisis to its geopolitical advantage.
Yeah, exactly. Because looking closely at the text, the weakness in the current framing is how it essentially assumes Beijing is backed into a corner.
Right, like they have no way out.
Right. It treats the 55 trapped Chinese vessels and, the millions of barrels of stranded oil as this fatal blow that just forces China to the negotiating table out of pure desperation.
Which is it creates a slightly one-dimensional view of their geopolitical calculus.
Yeah, it portrays Washington as holding all the leverage while China is just panicking.
Exactly. And it severely underestimates their strategic resilience. So the suggestion here is to fundamentally reframe China's position by emphasizing its strategic buffers.
Okay.
The author needs to shift the analytical angle to show how this immediate economic pain is actually offset by massive long-term geopolitical benefits.
Right, specifically resulting from the prolonged U.S. entanglement in the Middle East.
Spot on. And, to give the writers some concrete examples, keeping in mind these are just a few out of all the possible ways to solve this, we can start by looking at the physical logistics.
Yeah.
The text mentions the stranded oil, but it really needs to highlight China's massive strategic petroleum reserve.
Oh, the SPR, yeah, which sits at roughly, 1.3 to 1.4 billion barrels?
Exactly. And alongside that, you have their sharply increased overland Russian crude imports.
Right, acting as a shield.
Yeah, because when you calculate their daily consumption rate under wartime rationing protocols, that overland supply combined with the SPR buys Beijing months, maybe even years of operational runway without even needing the strait.
Wow. And if we look at the broader macroeconomic environment, the author needs to contrast the severe inflation ravaging the US and Europe with China's domestic deflationary environment.
Yeah, showing how China is economically insulated.
Because that macroeconomic contrast is where the real mechanics of this situation lie. The text correctly points out the global inflationary energy shock, but by ignoring China's domestic deflation, it misses half the physics of the scenario.
Oh, for sure.
It's essentially like using the vacuum of space to insulate a spacecraft against extreme external heat. The very absence of domestic economic pressure in China creates this thermal buffer against the inflationary shock that is actively destabilizing Western economies.
That is the exact dynamic the draft needs to capture. It's not just a buffer, it's an active geopolitical weapon. And that brings us to another concrete example the writer can weave in, which is the depletion of American military readiness.
Right.
While the U.S. might feel it has leverage over maritime trade routes, you have a bogged-down U.S. military depleting its advanced missile stocks like the SM-6s and Tomahawks at an alarming rate.
Drawing critical defense focus away from the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan, which is a massive strategic win for Xi Jinping.
Exactly.
It's like playing chess where sacrificing a knight actually opens up the board for a checkmate, The trap ships are a loss, but distracting the U.S. military is the winning move.
I love that analogy.
But I have to ask, if I'm putting myself in the writer's shoes, how do we balance the text to show this strategic duality without contradicting the severe economic data that's already presented?
What do you mean?
Well, the text spends pages detailing the severe slowdown in Chinese manufacturing due to energy rationing. If their factories are idling, isn't it a hard sell to claim they are secretly winning?
Well, it's not about claiming they are emerging completely unscathed, right? It's about contextualizing the damage.
Okay.
The author needs to structure this section to explicitly argue that China is actively accepting short-term tactical economic damage to achieve long-term strategic supremacy.
I see.
Bleeding American military bayonets dry in a secondary theater is well worth the cost of some trapped oil and a temporary manufacturing slump. You don't delete the economic data showing the factory slowdowns, you elevate the analysis.
By showing that Chinese leadership operates on a multi-decade timeline, while the U.S. is reacting to an immediate, daily crisis.
Exactly.
And I think by establishing that Beijing is willing to absorb that short-term damage to wait out Washington, the text inherently shows how this paralyzing staring contest between the superpowers forces every other nation on the board into a desperate corner.
Right.
I mean, while the US and China treat this as a geopolitical chessboard, secondary nations are fighting for immediate survival, which leads us to the next area of focus.
The narrative frames the conflict almost exclusively as a proxy battle between the United States and China, which inadvertently obscures the critical realignments and independent geopolitical maneuvers of regional powers directly destabilized by the war.
Yeah, because the fundamental weakness here is that the analytical lens is so tightly zoomed in on this new hegemonic duality between Washington and Beijing.
Right. It reduces entire regions like the Caucasus, the Gulf states, and Central Asia to mere collateral damage.
Like they're just static background scenery waiting for instructions.
Exactly. It ignores the fact that these nations are making independent strategic choices that could alter the global order. So the suggestion is to integrate the active geopolitical agency and cascading security crises of these secondary actors.
To demonstrate that this is a truly multipolar crisis that neither Washington nor Beijing can fully control.
Exactly. It adds so much depth and completeness to the geopolitical argument.
And for concrete examples, the author could incorporate the specific mobilization of Azerbaijani troops on the Iranian border. Right now, the draft kind of treats Iran solely as a target for U.S. and Israeli operations.
Yeah.
But from Aku's perspective, if the blockade triggers an internal collapse of the Iranian Central Authority, the massive ethnic Azeri population in northern Iran becomes a highly volatile factor.
Right. Azerbaijan isn't just sitting around waiting to see what Trump or Xi decide. They are mobilizing military assets right now.
Exactly. Securing their borders against spillover or the possibility of Israel utilizing their airspace.
That kind of localized agency completely changes the texture of the geopolitical map. And another excellent concrete example to implement is the formation of the C6 Diplomatic Forum by Central Asian nations aiming to protect their trade routes.
Oh, right.
Because you have landlocked countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that are suddenly terrified of losing their southern trade routes entirely.
So they start operating completely outside the US-China binary?
Exactly. The draft should detail how they are forming new independent multilateral architectures to bypass the conflict zones and protect their economies.
I see the structural value there, proving the limits of superpower control, but I want to push back slightly.
Sure.
Is there a risk that expanding the focus to include all these regional actors might dilute the writer's central thesis about US-China hegemony? I mean, the whole piece hinges on the Trump-Xi summit negotiations.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
If we pull the camera back too far, we might lose the narrative thread entirely.
It's a valid structural concern, but really only if these regional subplots are written as disconnected encyclopedic sidebars. The trick is to weave these regional subplots directly into the main Trump-Xi narrative to strengthen rather than distract from the core argument.
How would you suggest they do that?
Well, when Trump and Xi are engaged in high-level diplomatic posturing in Beijing, the author should cross-cut that with the chaotic reality of the CC nations scrambling to reroute the Trans-Caspian international transport route.
Oh, I see.
It demonstrates that while the hegemons negotiate the theoretical terms of the global order, the actual physical foundation of that order is actively fracturing beneath their feet.
Which makes the stakes of their summit infinitely higher. That's a great approach. And speaking of the foundation fracturing, another concrete example to discuss would be the profound, permanent shift in the Gulf states' narrative.
Yes, the illusion of the Gulf being a permanent safe haven for investment and expatriates has been irreversibly shattered.
Completely shattered. When commercial hubs suddenly feel vulnerable to direct kinetic warfare, the highly skilled expatriate labor force leaves and foreign direct investment permanently reroutes.
Right, you cannot simply unring that bell with a ceasefire agreement. The economic future of the Middle East alters permanently, independent of any US-China agreements.
And that concept of permanent geopolitical shifts like the end of the Gulf's safe haven status, provides the perfect link to the irreversible, permanent shifts happening in global commodities and trade.
While the material exhaustively catalogs immediate commodity shocks like oil and rare earths, it stops short of analyzing how these localized shortages will permanently rewire global supply chains and defense industrial bases.
Yeah, reading through the economics section, the weakness is that it reads too much like a temporary snapshot of market panics.
Like storing gas prices in grounded flights.
Exactly, or disrupted fertilizer shipments. But it fails to argue the long-term, irreversible consequences of this supply chain weaponization. It provides the data, but misses the ultimate so what of the data.
Implicitly assumes a rubber band effect. Like that once the Strait of Hormuz reopens, global trade just snaps back to its pre-war shape.
Right, which it won't.
Never. So the suggestion here is to elevate the economic analysis from short-term disruptions to long-term structural decoupling. Prove to the reader that the global economy is permanently fracturing rather than just hitting a temporary pause button.
And a concrete example to ground that would be to tie the Chinese export restrictions on heavy rare earths and permanent magnets directly to the U.S. Department of Defense's mandated 2027 deadline.
Yes, their deadline to eliminate Chinese supply from its defense industrial base.
Because when you analyze the mechanics of that mandate, the U.S. isn't just seeking a temporary workaround. By forcing the complete elimination of Chinese magnets by 2027, they are structurally severing a critical supply chain permanently.
Exactly. And it extends far beyond the defense sector, into the raw physics of auto manufacturing. The draft should discuss how the global shortage of crucial secondary commodities like helium for semiconductors, sulfur for agriculture, and tungsten for aerospace manufacturing will force a permanent geographic realignment of industrial production.
Because, you cannot synthesize helium, right?
Right. It's a finite byproduct of natural gas extraction, and it's essential for cooling processes in semiconductor fabs. If the Middle East is no longer a reliable source, the actual geographic hubs of industrial production are forced to relocate permanently.
Which makes the business-first relationship between Trump and Xi inherently unstable.
Exactly. The same applies to tungsten. You need it for rocket engine nozzles because it has the highest melting point of all discovered metals. You can't just substitute it with aluminum when the supply chain gets tight.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the sheer fragility of the global system. If we look at, say, Project Vault, or the $110 per kilogram price floors for rare earths, aren't these moves signs of deep systemic desperation rather than just calculated trade strategy?
Oh, absolutely.
How can the writer use these specific policy details to expose the deep vulnerabilities within the U.S. defense sector?
They should frame Project Vault and those massive price floors as glaring red flags of systemic panic. The U.S. defense sector is realizing in real time that it physically cannot build the weapons required to fight a modern war without importing raw materials from its primary geopolitical adversary.
Wow.
Which turns a dry economic statistic into a deafening alarm bell.
Exactly.
It exposes the fundamental hollow core of the U.S. industrial base, revealing that decoupling isn't just a political choice anymore. It's a panicked scramble for sovereign survival.
And that is the kind of deep, causal analysis that transforms a good geopolitical summary into a truly indispensable piece of predictive writing. Absolutely. Well, to briefly recap the three main takeaways for our listener today. First, deepen the analysis of China's strategic buffers to demonstrate how Beijing is deliberately absorbing short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term geopolitical leverage.
Right.
Second, incorporate the independent agency of regional powers like Azerbaijan and the Gulf states to prove this multipolar crisis is fracturing far beyond the control of Washington and Beijing. And finally, elevate the economic shocks to highlight permanent structural realignments and vulnerabilities in the U.S. defense industrial base.
The expertise evident in this source material is genuinely impressive.
It really is. We strongly encourage you to implement these actionable suggestions, and please submit your revised work back to the show for a future critique. Thanks for tuning in.